The night 200 riders surrounded a lonely ranch did not begin with drums or shouting or threats. It began with heat, the kind that pressed down on the Texas plains until even the wind seemed too tired to move. Dust hung in the air like a veil, and the sun burned white above the flat horizon. Gideon Hale had lived on that land long enough to know when a day felt wrong. At 36, he had buried more cattle than friends, fixed more broken fences than broken bones, and learned that trouble rarely announced itself. It crept in quietly, wearing the shape of something small and desperate. That afternoon, Gideon was knee-deep in mud by the creek, replacing a rotted post that had finally given up the fight. The water was low, barely more than a slow brown ribbon cutting through the land. He wiped sweat from his eyes and stood to stretch. His back, when movement near the far bank, caught his attention. At first he thought it was a calf, maybe one of the neighbor's strays. Then the shape stumbled, corrected itself, and stumbled again. It was a child. She walked like someone who had forgotten how legs worked, swaying from side to side, bare feet sinking into the dirt. Her clothing hung off her frame in tatters, patterned cloth torn and faded by sun and travel. Gideon froze. Out here, between Amarillo and nothing worth naming, a lone child did not appear by accident. He scanned the horizon, hand resting on the fence rail, half expecting riders to crest the rise. There were none, just the girl and the endless land. Every sensible thought he'd ever learned told him to go back to the house, to get his rifle, to keep his distance. Relations between settlers and the nearby Comanche. Bands had been stretched thin for years. Fear fed on rumor, and rumor fed on blood. Men disappeared. Stock vanished. Retaliation followed. Gideon had never taken part in it, but he knew how quickly a bad choice could turn deadly. The girl took another step and nearly fell. Gideon swore under his breath and started toward her. Slow and open, hands held where she could see them. As he closed the distance, he saw how thin she was, how her eyes seemed too large for her face, how her lips were cracked and bleeding. She said something in Comanche, words spilling out in a rush, and raised a trembling hand toward her mouth, then the water. He didn't understand her language, but he understood hunger. Gideon glanced once more at the empty land, then made his choice. He lifted her gently, surprised by how light she was, like lifting a bundle of dry sticks. She didn't fight. She barely reacted at all. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he carried her toward the cabin, her breathing shallow and uneven. Inside, the air was cooler. He set her on the only chair and moved fast, hands shaking as he ladled stew from the pot still warm on the stove. Bread sat wrapped in cloth on the counter. When the smell reached her, the girl's eyes fluttered open. She watched him with a mixture of fear and hope that made his chest tighten. As he knelt to hand her the bowl, something glinted at her collarbone. Gideon's stomach dropped. A necklace worked with care and precision, patterns he had seen before. A week earlier, an old trader passing through had spoken of those beads, of the family markings of a powerful Comanche chief known for both his discipline and his wrath. Gideon hesitated just for a moment. Then the girl reached out with shaking hands, and that was that. He let her eat. She devoured the food as if afraid it might vanish, spilling stew onto her clothes, tears streaking down her cheeks. Gideon sat back and watched, the weight of what he might have done pressing down on him. If she belonged to who he feared she did, then helping her was not a small kindness. It was an act that could end his life. As the sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the land, the girl finally slept. Gideon covered her with his only blanket and stood by the window, listening to the quiet. It didn't last. Hoofbeats thundered up the road just as the sky turned orange. 3 riders pulled hard and fast, dust boiling around them. Gideon stepped outside before they could shout. His neighbor, Silas Crow, looked ready to burst out of his skin. Smoke signals were seen in the hills, Silas said, voice tight. Word from town says a Comanche child's been missing for days. Folks are scared. Gideon didn't lie. He couldn't. He told them the truth in as few words as possible. The silence that followed felt heavier than any threat. One of the men shook his head. You've put a target on yourself. By the time they rode away, the first distant beat of drums rolled. Across the prairie, low, steady, unmistakable. Gideon closed his eyes. They were coming. The drums grew louder as night settled, each beat measured and calm. Not the wild chaos of a raid, but the deliberate rhythm of purpose. The girl woke and sat upright, eyes wide. She spoke urgently, pointing toward the dark beyond the window. Gideon crouched beside her, trying to keep his voice steady. though his pulse hammered in his ears. He didn't need words to understand when she raised her hands and counted. The number was more than he could face alone. 200 riders, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. When the drums stopped, the silence was unbearable. Shapes emerged from the darkness, horses moving in perfect order, forming a wide arc that slowly tightened around the cabin. Moonlight caught on feathers, on painted faces, on steel and wood shaped for killing. A voice carried from the dark, calm and heavy with authority. "White man, you have what is ours. Send her out." The girl clutched Gideon's shirt, shaking her head, making a sharp motion across her throat. Fear flashed through her eyes, not for herself, but for him. Gideon swallowed and stepped forward. He raised his hands and opened the door. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of horses and dust. The girl followed close behind, her small fingers wrapped tight in his sleeve. The riders sat motionless. At their center was a man who seemed carved from stone, streaks of gray in his hair, eyes dark and burning. The girl ran to him, speaking fast, her voice breaking. The man listened, expression hardening, then looked past her to Gideon. He dismounted and approached, each step deliberate. "You fed her," he said. "You sheltered her." "Yes," Gideon answered. "You knew who she was." Gideon didn't deny it. He explained, simply, honestly, knowing excuses would mean nothing. The chief studied him for a long time, then spoke words that turned Gideon's blood cold. Accusations of ransom, of deceit, of theft. Gideon reached into his pocket and produced a scrap of cloth, torn and stained. Proof he had kept, not knowing why, only that it felt right. Recognition flickered across the chief's face. Inside the cabin, the girl showed her father where she had slept, where she had eaten. She pointed to a worn photograph on the table. A woman and a young boy, their faces faded by time and touch. The chief's gaze lingered there. "You have lost children," he said quietly. Something shifted then. Not peace, not yet. But the edge dulled. Outside, murmurs rose among the warriors. One stepped forward, his anger sharp and loud. He demanded blood, demanded tradition. The chief answered him, firm but restrained. The tension cracked like dry wood. Then the girl stepped between them. She spoke with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so small, her words spilling out in a torrent. The warrior's anger faltered. Faces turned. Listening spread through the circle. The chief translated slowly. She spoke of hunger, of fear, of kindness without reward, of loss understood across enemies. When silence fell again, it was different this time, heavy with thought. The argument did not end there. Voices rose and fell, tradition clashing with something new and fragile. Finally, the chief turned to Gideon. "You will come with us," he said. "You will stand before our elders." The ride took hours, through paths Gideon had never known existed. Fires glowed in the distance as the camp came into view. The council gathered despite the hour, 7 elders seated in a half circle, eyes sharp despite their age. Gideon stood alone as the chief spoke. Then others followed, including the angry warrior. Gideon understood none of it, only the weight of judgment pressing down on him. Then the girl spoke again, calm now, certain. She answered a question put to her without hesitation. The chief turned to Gideon. "She believes you would do it again." The oldest elder rose. His voice, when translated, carried the sound of deep time. Mercy had been shown. Mercy would be returned. Protection would be given on one condition. If any of their people came to Gideon in need, he would offer the same help. Gideon agreed without pause. The girl hugged him, her words simple and broken, but full of meaning. Dawn broke pale and quiet as Gideon rode home, escorted not by enemies but by guards of honor. The land looked the same, yet everything had changed. His ranch became a place of uneasy peace, then cautious trust. People crossed boundaries they once feared. Gideon lived simply, never wealthy, never famous. He lived long enough to see the child grow into a woman who bridged worlds with words instead of weapons. Each year she returned, and they shared a meal, remembering the night when mercy outweighed blood. If this story moved you, if you believe courage sometimes looks like kindness instead of violence, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more powerful Old West stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and there are many more waiting to be told.